Indigenous disadvantage in Australia was highlighted over the weekend with tens of thousands of people taken to the streets around the nation. The inequality has been brought into sharp focus again this morning with a blunt plea from a prominent Queen's Birthday Honours recipient. Indigenous academic and activist Marcia Langton has used her honour to demand justice over Aboriginal deaths in custody. Indigenous Affairs correspondent Isabella Higgins has more.
Marcia Langton is one of the eminent Indigenous minds in Australia, one of the leading academics, and she has really doubled down on calls from protesters for a call to action on Australia's record of deaths in custody. Now, of course, Australia about 30 years ago had a royal commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and it found that Indigenous Australians were dying at rates that were not acceptable, that too many Indigenous Australians were coming into contact with the justice system. And now, 30 years later, our Indigenous incarceration rate is double what it was 30 years ago. And since then, more than 400 Aboriginal people have died in prison. So the international events surrounding the death of George Floyd, the protests around the world, these anti-racism protests, have resonated in Australia, and it's put Australia's record of deaths in custody at the forefront of national debates. And Marcia Langton, as you said, she has been awarded a Queen's Honour and has used this opportunity to call on the Australian government, on state governments, to take an action that for too long Indigenous people have died in prison and that it's not acceptable anymore. So let's take a listen to what she had to say.
There have been no convictions of any police officer ever for killing or assaulting Aboriginal people. There is no acknowledgement of this problem by the politicians and no effort to retrain the police force to stop them from killing us. I would have thought it's pretty straightforward. Do not kill Aborigines. How hard is that?
Marcia Langton there. And Isabella, what's the government had to say?
Well, so far the discussions around these protests have really been, should they have happened at all? There hasn't been a lot of discussion about what to do next. Yesterday we had government ministers discussing, criticising people who did go to those protests because, of course, those huge gatherings of tens of thousands of people, they happened in the context of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a pandemic and state governments were actually urging people in some states not to attend. So far there's been a lot of back and forth about whether they should have happened, whether it was the right move or the wrong move, but we haven't heard a great deal about. We've really had silence from state governments, and this morning we've heard from Indigenous, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, discussing the government's response. We can take a listen to what he's had to say.
I certainly will make every endeavour with my agency and with the relevant state and territory ministers to look at what we can collectively do. The trouble is the jails are, in all reality, managed by states and territory jurisdictions, but collectively as leaders there are things that we need to revisit and consider. And that would include looking at the triage process for Aboriginal people presenting at hospitals whilst they're in custody.
So, Joe, you can hear there a vague promise from the Minister to do better, definitely not a lot of detail or promise of action there. And I suppose part of the complexity in this problem around Indigenous deaths in custody is that a lot of this does fall on state governments. You're talking about jurisdictions needing to work together, the Commonwealth and the states. That Royal Commission 30 years ago, when it handed down its recommendations, it was actually just 10% of the recommendations that were solely focused on the Commonwealth government itself, that things that they needed to do, and about I think it's about 2/3 were a joint responsibility of the state and Commonwealth, and then more than a third was for state governments purely to enact. So it is complex, and of course the issues that we see in our justice system are often a symptom of broader societal problems, things like housing, education, poverty, community safety. So it's not an easy thing to fix. There's no silver bullet. It requires multiple jurisdictions to work together and to broadly look at the lives that Aboriginal people are living in Australia.